Sometimes people blame timing because the truth is harder to admit. They say, "It was not the right time. We were in different places. Too much was happening. Maybe it was meant to happen later." Sometimes those things are true, but sometimes timing becomes an easier explanation for something deeper. Emotional unreadiness. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that distinction. For a long time, they believed that certain connections simply appeared at the wrong moment. They believed that if circumstances had been different, everything would have unfolded naturally. But as they have grown older and more aware of themselves, they have started looking at those memories differently. They are asking questions they never asked before. Was the timing really wrong? Or was I simply not ready? That question has changed the way they remember the past. Because there were moments when life actually gave them opportunities. Moments when someone was present. Moments when affection was mutual. Moments when something meaningful could have grown. But instead of moving closer, they hesitated. They waited. They analyzed. They found reasons to postpone emotional decisions. At the time, those reasons felt logical. Now they can see that fear was sometimes hiding behind logic. Your soulmate has always considered themselves a thoughtful person. They like to think before acting. They analyze possibilities. They consider consequences. They rarely want to make emotional decisions impulsively. Those qualities can be valuable. But there is a point where thinking becomes avoidance. A point where waiting for certainty becomes a way of avoiding vulnerability. Your soulmate is beginning to recognize that point. And this realization has been surprisingly emotional. They have started remembering moments when they could have allowed themselves to experience love more openly. They remember conversations that had potential, small signs of affection, moments when they felt unusually connected to someone. And then they remember what happened next. They pulled back, not because the connection was meaningless, because it was becoming meaningful. That distinction is difficult to admit. Sometimes people are comfortable with casual feelings. They become uncomfortable when those feelings begin demanding honesty. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that about themselves. They could handle attraction. They could handle friendship. They could handle emotional closeness as long as it remained undefined. But once something began feeling real, their defenses appeared. Suddenly they needed more time, more space, more certainty, more reasons to wait. They thought they were protecting themselves from making the wrong choice. Now they wonder whether they were also preventing themselves from making a meaningful one. This realization naturally brings your connection into their thoughts. They remember the emotional atmosphere around you. Maybe they did not have the words for it then. Maybe they simply knew that something felt different. There was a comfort they could not easily explain. An emotional familiarity, a sense that conversations could move beyond surface-level topics. A feeling that they were being seen in ways they were not accustomed to. Those things should have made them feel safe. Instead, they made them vulnerable, and vulnerability made them hesitate. Now they understand why. The more meaningful something becomes, the more there is to lose. For someone who fears emotional disappointment, that can create a strange reaction. They may want the connection, and simultaneously fear what wanting it means. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that contradiction. They no longer see it as evidence that their feelings were false. They see it as evidence that their feelings were stronger than their emotional readiness at the time. That is a completely different perspective. It also explains why certain memories never fully disappeared. If something truly meant nothing, they would not need to keep explaining why it ended. But they have spent a long time explaining. Wrong timing, different circumstances, too many responsibilities, too much uncertainty. Eventually, every explanation began sounding incomplete, because one question remained. What if the timing was not the real problem? What if I was the one who needed to grow? That question has been changing them. They are no longer waiting for life to become perfectly convenient before allowing themselves to feel. They are learning that meaningful relationships rarely arrive under perfect circumstances. People have responsibilities, fears, past experiences, uncertainty. Nobody becomes completely ready for love. Sometimes readiness develops because you choose to face the vulnerability instead of waiting for it to disappear. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that. They are learning that emotional courage does not mean knowing exactly what will happen. It means being willing to participate in something meaningful even without complete certainty. That is what they were missing before, not necessarily love, courage. They had feelings. They simply did not know what to do with them. And now, with greater awareness, they can finally admit that. This realization does not mean they want to recreate the past exactly as it was. They are not trying to pretend nothing changed. They understand that people grow, circumstances change, life moves forward. But some lessons remain. And one of the biggest lessons your soulmate carries now is this. If something genuinely matters, do not automatically call it bad timing just because it makes you uncomfortable. Sometimes discomfort is not a warning. Sometimes it is simply the feeling of growing beyond the person you used to be. Your soulmate is learning that now. And perhaps that is why love feels different to them today. They are no longer searching for perfect circumstances. They are searching for emotional truth. They want to know what they genuinely feel. They want to understand what they genuinely want. And most importantly, they want to become brave enough to acknowledge it. Because perhaps the greatest realization is not that the past should have happened differently. It is that the person they are becoming now would handle it differently. And that changes everything. The more your soulmate accepted that emotional readiness had been part of the problem, the more peacefully they began looking at the past. They stopped asking, "Why didn't everything work out?" and started asking, "What was I supposed to learn from it?" That question created a completely different kind of reflection. Instead of searching for someone to blame, they started looking at themselves. They recognized the moments when they had chosen comfort over honesty. They remembered times when they knew something mattered, but still refused to make a clear decision. They remembered opportunities when they could have communicated openly but chose to wait. Not because they did not care, because they were afraid of what caring might require from them. That was the truth they had avoided. Love asks for participation. It asks you to be present. It asks you to communicate. It asks you to accept that another person's feelings can matter to you. And for someone who had spent years protecting their independence, that could feel frightening. Your soulmate now understands that independence and emotional closeness are not opposites. You can have your own identity and still deeply care about someone. You can have personal boundaries and still allow love into your life. You can need space without using space as a way to avoid intimacy. This understanding has changed their idea of commitment. They once thought commitment meant knowing exactly where everything was going. Now they understand that sometimes commitment simply means being honest about what exists today. You do not need to know the entire future to acknowledge a genuine feeling. You do not need every answer before having an important conversation. You do not need complete certainty before taking one sincere step towards someone. That realization has brought a strange calmness into their heart. They no longer feel the same need to predict every possible outcome. They are learning to experience the present. And when they think about your connection, this lesson becomes even clearer. They remember how often they may have searched for reasons not to move emotionally closer. Maybe they questioned whether it was practical. Maybe they worried about getting hurt. Maybe they wondered whether the connection would actually last. Maybe they were simply afraid of becoming attached. At the time, those questions seemed important. Now they realize that questions are not always meant to stop a person. Sometimes questions are simply invitations to communicate. They could have asked. They could have talked. They could have allowed you to share your perspective. Instead, they sometimes tried to solve everything inside their own head. That created unnecessary distance. Your soulmate understands that now. They are learning that relationships cannot be completely understood from one person's perspective. Two people have to participate in the conversation. Two people have to reveal what they feel. Two people have to decide what the connection means. This is why their understanding of love is becoming more mature. They no longer believe love is about finding the perfect circumstances. They believe it is about finding two people willing to be honest within imperfect circumstances. That is a very different idea. It means life does not have to be completely settled before love can exist. It means two people can grow while they are connected. They can learn together. They can make mistakes. They can communicate. They can adjust. And they can choose whether the connection still deserves their effort. This perspective has softened their heart. They no longer see vulnerability as a threat. They see it as information. If they feel nervous around someone, they can ask why. If they miss someone, they can acknowledge it. If they feel deeply connected, they do not have to immediately run from the feeling. They can simply sit with it. That is what emotional maturity looks like for them now. Not having no fear, knowing what to do when fear appears. And there is another realization quietly developing. They are beginning to understand that sometimes a person does not regret loving someone. They regret not being brave enough to be honest about that love. That difference has stayed with them. Because when they look back at their connection with you, they do not only remember what happened, they remember what remained unsaid. They remember the moments that could have gone in a different direction if they had simply spoken honestly. They remember the emotions they tried to minimize. They remember how often they told themselves, maybe later. Now they understand how easily later can become never. That lesson has changed them. They do not want to postpone every meaningful conversation until they feel completely prepared. Because perhaps complete preparation never comes. Perhaps courage simply means deciding that something matters enough to be acknowledged. Your soulmate is learning that now. They are also learning not to romanticize missed opportunities. They understand that the past cannot be recreated. You cannot return to the exact person you were. You cannot return to the exact circumstances. You cannot repeat the same moment with the same emotions and the same awareness. But you can become wiser because of it. You can carry the lesson forward. You can become more honest, more communicative, more emotionally present. And that is what your soulmate is trying to do. They are not becoming obsessed with what could have happened. They are becoming more intentional about what happens next. That distinction is important. Because growth does not mean living in regret. Growth means allowing regret to teach you without allowing it to control you. Your soulmate is slowly reaching that balance. They can appreciate what the connection meant without forcing the past to become the future. They can acknowledge their feelings without demanding an outcome. They can still carry love in their heart while respecting reality. That is a much healthier kind of emotional attachment. And perhaps that is why the thought of you now feels less painful and more peaceful. You became part of a chapter that taught them something profound. They learned what emotional connection felt like. They learned where their fears were strongest. They learned how easily uncertainty could become avoidance. And now they are learning how to respond differently. If another meaningful connection enters their life, they do not want to repeat the same pattern. They want to communicate. They want to listen. They want to give affection without immediately fearing what it might cost. They want to be honest before distance becomes the answer. And if your paths cross again, they want to meet that moment with greater emotional maturity than before. Not with promises about what must happen. Not with assumptions. Simply with honesty. Because perhaps the real lesson was never that the timing was wrong. Perhaps the lesson was that they needed time to become the person who could recognize what love was asking of them. And now they are becoming that person. Someone who understands that love is not always convenient. It does not always arrive when life is perfectly organized. It does not always wait until fear disappears. Sometimes love arrives while you are still learning. And the question is not, am I completely ready? The question is, am I willing to grow? Your soulmate is finally willing to ask that question. And maybe that is the quiet shift that matters most. They are no longer waiting for life to remove every obstacle. They are learning how to become emotionally strong enough to face them. They are no longer calling every uncertainty a sign to walk away. They are learning to communicate before making conclusions. They are no longer assuming that protecting themselves means avoiding emotional risk. They are learning that some risks are worth approaching carefully, and love, when it is healthy, honest, and mutual, can be one of them. So perhaps the past was not simply a story about bad timing. Perhaps it was a story about two people meeting at a moment when one heart still had lessons to learn. And now those lessons have been learned differently. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to create a new understanding. Your soulmate knows now that timing matters, but so does readiness. Circumstances matter, but so do choices. Fear matters, but so does courage. And love matters most when someone is willing to meet it honestly. That is the person your soulmate is becoming. And whatever the future brings, they will carry this realization with them. Because sometimes the greatest change does not happen when another person returns. It happens when you finally become capable of responding differently, if they ever do.